Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Alex Newman about the American public education system. Mr. Newman is a journalist and correspondent with The New American, focusing on economics, education, and politics. He is the co-author with Dr. Samuel Blumenfield of Crimes of the Educators: How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy American Children. You can follow his work at thenewamerican.com and at WND.com. You can find him on Twitter at AlexNewman_JOU. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/education-crimes. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you guys very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, this is a pretty provocative title of that book you have that you've co-authored. What exactly do you mean when you say Crimes of the Educators and Destroying American Children?
It is a very provocative title, I realize that, but I'm 100% confident that after reading the book, there is nobody who would disagree with what's stated in the title. We identify a series of crimes that are being committed by educators, and I will point out here that by educators, we don't mean your everyday teacher in your first or second grade classroom, right? We're not talking about everyday teachers. I'm actually a teacher. I teach high school students. I teach economics to high school students, and it would be ridiculous to call teachers criminals. What we're talking about here is the education establishment, right? The people that run the teachers' colleges, the people who kind of set education policy, whether we're talking about in Washington, D.C., or in the major think tanks, or the Bill Gates of the world who are trying to foist Common Core and even beyond this globalized education system on us. So that's really who we're identifying as criminals in the book. And what we do is we highlight a series of crimes that are being committed by this education establishment and actual prosecutable crimes. There's statutes specifically making these things illegal that are being perpetrated against the American people, against the American taxpayer, and especially against America's children. And when we say that these government schools are being used to destroy America's children, we mean that quite literally, actually. We mean it mentally. Right? They're deliberately causing illiteracy in the children. Again, not your everyday teacher, right? They don't really understand what's happening here, which is one of the reasons we want to get this information out so badly. But the methods that they're using, and we can talk about this in a moment, I think it's a key point, but the methods that they're using to teach reading have been known since the 1840s to cause reading disabilities and to promote illiteracy, and yet they're still using them. So, that's one of the ways they're destroying America's children, just mentally destroying them, removing their capacity to even educate themselves, right? If they can't read properly, they're not even going to have the capability of educating themselves. So they're destroying America's children mentally. They're destroying America's children spiritually, right? Teaching them all kinds of lies, preaching humanism as if it was, gospel truth. In place of, biblical religion, in place of objective moral values and things like that. So what we argue is that the children are really being destroyed in the truest sense, right? And I think if you look around you in America today, it's really not as controversial a claim as it might sound like. I mean, what do we see if we look around? We see ghettos, we see drug use, we see gangs, we see, just absolute insanity everywhere you look. And where is all this coming from? Well, what Dr. Blumenfeld and I argue, and I think we argue, using primary source documents, that this is part of the plan, is that the source of this, it has become the government education system.
Right, and we'll return to the literacy issue in a few moments. But when you talk about things that are flat out illegal via statutes, can you give some examples of the statutes that are being violated?
Sure. The first and obviously the most serious crime that we allege is treason. And I realize, again, that sounds quite spectacular, but let me give some context and some background here. In 1983, Ronald Reagan put together this commission, the National Commission on Excellence in Education. And this committee concluded, and you guys know, government committees aren't normally famous for over-the-top language or rhetoric, but they said that this education system was so bad that if it had been imposed on us by a foreign power, we may well have considered it an act of war. So that's pretty serious language from a bureaucratic commission, right? They said this education system threatens our future as a nation and as a people. So this is serious language, right? If we would consider this monstrosity of an education system an act of war, if it had been imposed on us by foreigners, why would we treat it any less seriously if it was imposed on us by domestic enemies of our system of government, of our liberties, of basically everything that the United States was founded on and stands for? And we have documented primary source evidence showing that the people who designed this system wanted to, if not outright wage war on the United States, they wanted to overthrow the U.S. Constitution. They wanted to overthrow our system of government and overthrow our liberties. And they set out with that goal in mind. Actually, John Dewey, the key architect of this monstrosity that we call an education system, was very clear about what he wanted. He wanted to make America socialist. He even showed us what he wanted. There was a book published in 1888 by Edward Bellamy, statist extraordinaire. And he wanted a communist America by the year 2000. So that's what this book was. It was this kind of fantasy of an America in the year 2000 where there was no private property, there was no liberty, everybody just worked for the good of the collective and so on. And that is what John Dewey wanted. So, if a foreign power imposed this, we would consider it an act of war, yet when people who just happen to be born in the United States do it for the same reason, to destroy our liberties, to undermine our free system of government, then we don't consider that a problem? Well, Dr. Blumenfeld and I both consider that to be treasonous, right? To hijack the education system and the minds of the young for ulterior motives like imposing collectivization and collectivism and socialism on the American people. We consider that treasonous.
And I love how you guys don't pull any punches. I mean, the first chapter title right in your face is Treason, the Deliberate Dumbing Down of a Nation. So there's no hiding this. You go right at it. But since you mentioned John Dewey and you mentioned Edward Bellamy, who are some of the other key figures in the early days of the American public school system?
Well, we start at John Dewey, actually. We really, if we wanted to be totally comprehensive, we could go back even further and we could look at Horace Mann. We did not dwell on him a lot in the book just because we wanted to stay focused on more current things. And, Horace Mann, we don't have documentary proof that his intentions were evil, right? He pretended to be this idealist. He's the one who imported the Prussian system of government schools to the United States. So, he caused a lot of damage, but we don't know, for a fact that he had these evil intentions, right? Overthrowing our system of government, overthrowing our liberties, creating a socialist society. He claimed to want equality and all these nice things. But so we really start with John Dewey and the people around John Dewey. First, I think it's helpful to look at the finances, right? Where did John Dewey get the money to create this monstrous system that we call government education today? Well, he got it from the Rockefellers, right? The Rockefellers had a charity, so-called. It was the General Education Board, and they provided millions of dollars to Dewey to promote this quackery across America. So what John Dewey did really was hijack, using Rockefeller money and a bunch of his cohorts, a lot of whom were educated under Wilhelm Wundt over at the University of Leipzig in Germany, these educational psychologists. They used the system that Horace Mann had brought into the United States, this Prussian education system. They hijacked it and they engineered it so that it would deliberately, as we say in the book, dumb down the American people. And I mean, that was very clearly their plan. I mean, we even reprinted some of Dewey's essays to make this point. He didn't even really beat around the bush. He talked about, well, we have to do this quietly and under the radar, because if people found out, there might be a violent reaction that's going to jeopardize the success of our plan. This is the language of a conspirator. This is a language of someone who has something to hide. If what they were doing was so great, they would have done it out in the open. But instead, they chose to do it under the radar in an underhanded way. And, again, I think the evidence is quite clear that John Dewey wanted to dumb down the population of the United States. He wanted to reduce the literacy of the American people. He wanted to erode the values and the faith of the American people for the specific purpose of imposing this new collectivist system on us. And, he went over to the Soviet Union and he worked with Lenin on their school system over there, and he wanted that here. he came back with lots of ideas from the Soviet Union about how we might do that here. And, I should point out, just to be fair to John Dewey, that he didn't have the benefit that we have. We have 100 years where we can look back in history now and see what this socialism has actually produced in the real world, right? Mass murder, 100 million, 200 million dead people, terrorism. We have the Soviet Union, National Socialism in Germany, Communist China murdered 60 to 80 million people. So John Dewey didn't have that. And so we should be fair to him and say, maybe he didn't realize how horrible all of this would be. But to surreptitiously seize control of the education system, to dumb down students for the purpose of implementing this totalitarian ideology, in our view, is just absolutely criminal and treasonous. And so, that's just the first of the crimes.
Right.
We go through a whole bunch of them, but that's obviously the most serious. And then we have, encouraging delinquency among minors, pushing pornographic sex education in the schools, pushing drugs on the students, fraud and embezzlement. Of course, you have this education establishment. It consumes almost $1 trillion every year now under the guise of educating people, and really they're doing the opposite of that. There's no educating going on here. There's indoctrination, and there's dumbing down under the guise of educating. And if any businessman were to sell a product for $1 trillion a year that did the opposite of what they said it did, that would be fraud. They would be prosecuted in a court of law, and quite properly so. And yet the education establishment gets away with it. And, this is a crime of monumental proportions.
Right. And on the subjects of Horace Mann and the Prussian school system, I want to encourage everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/education-crimes, the show notes page for this episode, because I did a couple of episodes with David Rodriguez, and we cover those topics in those episodes. But since you're talking about all of these crimes, I think most people have an inherent sense of just how poorly educated Americans are in the public school system today. And we'll look at some of these individual crimes in a moment. But do you have some statistics that can really help paint a picture of just how poorly educated Americans are today?
I'm glad you asked, actually, and I think this is really some rock-solid evidence in terms of what we're arguing here. It literally could not possibly happen by accident. I mean, even the most ridiculous, mentally challenged people in the universe could not design such a poor system that you would get these kinds of outcomes. Let me give you some numbers, though. Just recently, I came across a state education agency report on Washington, D.C., and this is an official government report, and what they said was 2/3, or more than 2/3, of the residents of Washington, D.C., over the age of 15 years old, are functionally illiterate. So, maybe they can read a stop sign if we're lucky. But when it comes to actual reading, even the ingredients list on the, a can of soup, that's out of the question, much less the Bible, the Constitution, a history book, a science book. There's no possibility. So that's unbelievable. Then the federal government actually did a literacy survey and published it in 1993. And, of course, it's gotten much worse since then. But what they found was that 55% of Americans were reading at the worst two levels. So they had a scale of 1 to 5. 1 being, you can't read anything. 2 being you're basically functionally illiterate, but maybe you can read stop signs and stuff. And 5 being, you're a decent reader, you can do well. 55% of Americans scored in the bottom two, 1 and 2. So, how is it that we can spend $1 trillion a year on so-called education, and yet over 50% of the American people read at the worst two levels? I mean, we shouldn't even really call it reading. It's basically not reading. It's astounding, and especially when you consider, you can teach I've done it. You can teach a 4-year-old how to read in a matter of a month with practically no effort if you do it the correct way. How is it possible that this could have happened?
Right. It sounds so absurd to our listeners, I'm sure, and to me. It just sounds crazy. And there must obviously be a problem with the way that people are being taught to read. So what is that method right now? How are people taught to read? And is there a problem with the methods?
Yes, I'm glad you asked, because this is really at the heart of the matter. And, if you have kids that you love, if you have your own kids, if you have grandkids, if you have nephews or nieces or, whatever it is, if you're a teacher, if you know kids, you need to take action to protect them. So I'll break it down very quickly. My co-author, who unfortunately passed away last year, he actually wrote a whole book on this back in the 1970s, The New Illiterates. And what he did was basically the first of its kind, an extensive analysis of the reading materials then being used in government schools across the nation. And I think the best way to explain what's happening now is so first I'll explain the correct way of teaching reading, right? We have a phonetic alphabet, and when a person who reads properly reads, what happens is they recognize each symbol, which is associated with a sound. So a letter is a symbol, and it's associated with a sound. So an S would sound like S, and a T would sound like T. And, simple stuff like that. That's basically phonics, right? That's how our alphabet and how our writing system works. It was a huge, spectacular development in terms of being able to record and transfer knowledge, right? You could basically take any word in existence and express it in written form. Whereas, previous forms of writing, things like certain forms of hieroglyphs, maybe the Chinese writing system is a very good example, you had symbols that represented whole words or ideas, right? So the traditional way, and it worked like this for hundreds, thousands of years, of teaching to read in English and other languages that use our alphabet, was you teach that each letter is associated with a particular sound or with multiple sounds, and then you teach the children how these work together. So how do you blend, different sounds in different letters, and that's how you learn to read, right? That's the correct way of learning how to read. That's how people have learned how to read for time immemorial. That's how people still learn how to read all over the world when they're learning to read successfully. When you look at what goes on in our government schools today, though, and I realize this sounds almost too ridiculous to people who are fortunate enough to learn how to read the correct way. But what they're doing is they're teaching this method. There's a number of different words to conceal what's going on here. They call it the whole word method, the look-say method, or the sight method. Basically, what they have the children do is memorize whole words as if whole words were a symbol. So let me give you an example. They might have the word cat, right? They'll write the word cat. They'll put it next to a picture of a cat, and they'll say, this here means cat. Right? So the children are expected to remember that the series of squiggly lines means cat. And they'll do this with, they'll start off with lots of simple words. Some of the readers, see spot run spot run, things like that. So the kids are supposed to memorize these whole words as if the words themselves were the symbols rather than the letters and the phonetic sounds they make being the symbols. So what happens when you do this? I should say that there are some people who can learn how to read, we might say adequately. Maybe adequately is not quite the right word, but who can, at least get by learning how to read using this sight method. But for the overwhelming majority of people, this causes lifelong problems. Obviously, illiteracy is the most serious one, because what you do is you train your brain to approach reading as reading a series of symbols that are whole words. And, of course, this flies in the face of all logic, right? This was actually first tried in the 1840s under Horace Mann in the Boston schools, and it was such a disaster that it was yanked out after a few years because the kids weren't learning how to read. They were ending up with reading disabilities. So they yanked it out of the schools, and then this was resurrected by John Dewey. And, at this point, we have all kinds of technology that even shows how insane this is. We have brain scans that we can do, and this has been done, where you look at the brains of children who learned how to read the correct way and compare them to children who learned how to read using this quackery called the whole word method. And what you see is literally physical impairment in the brains of people who are learning to read using this quack methodology. And unfortunately, the quack methodology is the norm across the United States today. Now, you have some teachers who are aware of this, and so they kind of go rogue and they teach their kids phonics, and they teach their kids that the letters have sounds associated with them and so on. But in most government schools today, and Common Core actually cements this into place, they teach children to recognize whole words as if the whole word was the symbol rather than the letter. And, then in Common Core, they add a little sprinkling of phonics after you've already damaged the children and taught them to try to read by looking at words as if they were an entire symbol in and of themselves. Then they add in, they call them context clues and phonetic clues, so that the kids can, not sound totally ridiculous and say pony when the word says dog. But that's basically where we are. We explore that quite a bit in the book. It's so tragic what's happened here, and it's so easy to fix. You can teach literally a 4-year-old how to read with almost no effort if you teach them phonics. It's natural, it's logical, it's obvious, but when you see the method that's being used in government schools across the country, I mean, you would be shocked and appalled. And for parents, for people who want to protect children that they love, you have to be really careful, because you'll see books that are advertised as phonics books, and then you'll turn to the first page and it says, memorize this list of words. So, it's unfortunately pervasive in our society, and especially in the government school system. And, the results speak for themselves. We can, judge it by its fruits. Look around us. Are we getting more intelligent? Are we a society of good readers? Of course we're not.
And hasn't that method contributed to the increase in dyslexia as well?
Yes, actually. What Dr. Blumenfeld argued, and he studied this for 50 years, was that this quack method of reading is actually the cause of dyslexia. And there's a lot of research that suggests that is exactly what's going on here. So Dr. Blumenfeld actually cured people who had dyslexia. The experts like to pretend it's some mysterious disorder that nobody understands. Maybe it's genetic. Maybe it's a brain problem. And no, what it is it's a problem with the way that reading is taught. So what Dr. Blumenfeld would do when a dyslexic would come to him, or a parent would bring a dyslexic child, was he would start them from scratch. And it's really hard, because the brain, the way it works is it kind of gets used to things, right? It settles into these reflexes. So if they keep drilling it into the kid, with flashcards, this word is cat, this word is dog, this word, it's very hard to undo the damage. It takes a lot of effort. Some of the patients that Dr. Blumenfeld worked with, they described it as painful, right? Trying to unlearn this quack whole word method and trying to relearn how to read using phonics. But it can be done. Dr. Blumenfeld did it with many, many people. And, I'm convinced that is the cause of dyslexia. And I know a lot of brilliant educators and researchers who say the same thing. Even people who disagree with, virtually everything I say politically, PhDs have come to these same conclusions. And I see it happen all the time. Since we published this book, I've heard from so many teachers who say, that's what's wrong. These kids come into my class perfectly normal. They're smart. They're ready to go. Then, they end up dyslexic. They end up not being able to read. And the reason is very simple. It's because of the way they're being taught to read.
Who are the institutions and who are the people who are perpetuating these absurd ways of reading?
Well, actually, if you go all the way back to John Dewey, you see where the strongholds of this are, right? Columbia University, the Teachers College at Columbia University, was really one of the original strongholds for promoting this. Also the University of Chicago. So these are the two institutions where Dewey worked with Rockefeller money and where he trained all his disciples. And what they did was they trained up, lots and lots of these educators who then went and took over all of the state education colleges and all the schools where they taught reading. So generations of teachers have been taught through no fault of their own. They go to these education colleges assuming they're going to learn how to properly teach children, and these education colleges perpetuate these false and really ridiculous claims about the teaching of reading. Now, we're certainly not the first ones to draw attention to this. In the 50s, Rudolf Flesch came out with Why Johnny Can't Read, and he blew the lid off of this. He blew it wide open. Why Johnny can't read is because they're using quack methods to teach him how to not read, and this is causing lifelong disabilities. And since then, he later came out with Why Johnny Still Can't Read, right? And so people have been drawing attention to this all along, and there's been, sometimes it's called the reading wars, right? You've had these opposing camps, the phonics advocates versus the whole word advocates, and unfortunately, the whole word advocates, rather than admit their mistake, they kind of closed ranks, right? And they started creating all these institutions for reading, and they control all the journals and the teaching colleges and so on. And, so it's very much like any other field you look at. You get this entrenched elite that will not admit that it's wrong, that believes it's kind of like this priesthood. And, it becomes very difficult to expose them. But the facts speak for themselves. The studies speak for themselves. I'm working with a number of teachers now. We're trying to compile a big book of the studies that actually have been done on this, so that people can see very clearly that the research that is out there shows conclusively that the whole word method is quackery and it damages children and it produces illiteracy, and that the correct way of teaching reading is really the phonics method. So.
Well, and of course, there aren't just issues with the way reading is taught. There are a lot of problems with the way math is taught and the way writing is taught. And then in turn, you have limitations in the abilities of students to think critically resulting from all of this. So what are some of the issues with the way math and writing and some of the other subjects are taught?
You're exactly right. And so, reading, we consider reading the most crucial, because if people can read, they can educate themselves, right? If people can read, they can go out and they can read a book. So if they didn't learn how to do math properly in school, they can go to the library and pick up a book, right? But we have some chapters on the new methods of teaching math, which is, really quackery disguised as education. And same thing with writing, right? Under the Common Core, they're even trying to abolish cursive, because, learning how to write cursive is actually very good for your brain, way beyond just being able to read cursive. It's extremely conducive to critical thinking and to proper mental functioning, and so they want to get rid of that. I don't know if you guys have seen a lot of the Common Core math that's coming out, but they're practically taking direct aim at even this idea that there is objective truth, right? So 2 + 2 doesn't even necessarily equal 4 anymore. It might equal 5 or 6, or depending on how we feel and how we get the answer. And this is absolute insanity, right? You have people with PhDs in mathematics and accounting and engineering who can't even help their second graders do their homework, their math homework, because what's happening is just so crazy. And going back to your previous questions about some of the institutions that are involved in perpetuating this, I can't possibly not mention that they're trying to standardize this now at the global level. So you have UNESCO, the UN's education agency. It's the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, trying to push these methodologies at the global level, right? Dr. Blumenfeld and I did an analysis of UNESCO's proposed global reading methodologies. And it's basically, they call it the balanced approach, right? So it's the whole word method mixed with a little sprinkling of phonics, just exactly as Common Core proposes. And, they want to get this done at the global level. And you see the same thing in all the other subjects, right? UNESCO is coming out with global guidelines on everything from sex education, right? They want to teach 4- and 5-year-olds about masturbation, and they want 12-year-olds to be able to advocate legal and safe abortions and tax-funded abortions. So we have this effort to kind of institutionalize this at the planetary level. And, people should think about the implications of that. This is a nightmare waiting to happen.
One thing that's brought up pretty frequently whenever you talk with teachers or anyone in the education industry is standardized testing and what it means to have all these standardized tests, especially No Child Left Behind. So what do you think about those, and what have you heard?
The standardized tests are very important to this agenda. Really, it's the enforcement mechanism, right? If they don't have the standardized tests, they can't make sure that teachers all across the country are successfully dumbing down students, right? So they need these tests to make sure that the kids are all, and I think there's this mistake out there that's very prevalent, that these tests actually measure, academic knowledge and skills and things like that. Really, if you look at the essence of these tests are much more geared at measuring values and feelings and these, social, emotional learning is how they describe it in the federal statutes. So what we're seeing now, these nationalized standardized tests are really the enforcement mechanism to make sure that every student, they don't want to leave any child behind, as Ted Kennedy and Bush put it in the name of their statute, right? No child left behind. So to be able to standardize the dumbing down, which they call education, they need to have an enforcement mechanism. They need to know that each and every child is receiving the same dumbed down education, and they use these standardized tests, first of all, to measure and make sure that that's happening, and second of all, as an enforcement tool against teachers, right? If you go out of your way to teach your students properly, and then they flop on these standardized tests, well, then immediately the establishment says, aha, there's a teacher who's breaking the mold and who's not complying with our dumbing down, and so then they need to have their pay docked, they need to be fired, they need to be disciplined, whatever the case may be. So they're kind of, a multifaceted purpose here from these tests, but the key point to keep in mind about these tests is that they are the enforcement mechanism for the powers that be to enforce their agenda in the schools. Without them, they would have no way of, first of all, making sure that everything is happening the way they want it to happen, and second of all, of taking action to make sure that the teachers fall into line.
Right, and just to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about when we say No Child Left Behind, can you explain what we're referring to and what was involved with that act?
Sure. That was an act passed by Congress. Actually, it was written by Ted Kennedy, one of the most supposedly liberal members of the Congress, and it was signed by Bush. Right? People often consider it a Bush law, but Bush didn't have any power to make laws, and he was the president, not the Congress. So what this law did was basically set up the system, and actually I shouldn't even say set up, because the system had already been in place for quite some time. Clinton started with the goals 2000 and so on. But what the Bush era statute did was create they call it the accountability system for enforcing what eventually Obama would come about with the Common Core. So basically it demanded that each state set up testing regimes. And these testing regimes needed to measure, such and such and such, and they needed to make sure that the schools were complying with federal statutes and regulations and so on. So No Child Left Behind was an effort to make sure that every child in the government school system was receiving the appropriate dumbing down through the government education system. So it was really the next step in nationalizing, globalizing, and standardizing what they refer to, I argue very misleadingly, as education.
All right, and since you keep mentioning Common Core, can you give a brief overview of what Common Core is and what some of the big problems are with it?
Sure. Well, Common Core, I know it's gotten a lot of people really riled up in terms of education, and that's a good thing. But what it is a set of national standards. Bill Gates, of course, was the main private sector financier, if you will. He dumped a study I saw said about $2.3 billion of his own money into creating and promoting it. But it's a set of national standards. It was developed by an organization called Achieve Inc., which, with the permission and the support of the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Now, despite the names, both of these organizations are actually federally funded lobbying groups, right? These are not just these ad hoc committee of governors. These are groups that are funded by the federal government, establishment groups, and they wanted these national standards. So they drew up these standards. Actually, if you look at the names of the people who were involved in this, it's, establishment on steroids, right? All these Council on Foreign Relations people, Bilderberg people, Trilateral Commission people, big business, big government, all of them coming together. And so they set up these national standards, and they had the Obama administration use federal funding as a kind of hammer to impose it on all the states. 46 states initially approved these. A few held out, right? Texas and Alaska and Virginia, Nebraska, and then Minnesota only accepted, I think it was the English standards, or it might have been only the math standards. But, to show how terrible these are, I can point to just one very simple and very obvious piece of evidence. To kind of prove the worth of these standards, the Common Core people put together what they called their validation committee, the Common Core Validation Committee. And they had two subject matter experts on this committee. One was Dr. Sandra Stotsky. She was an expert in the English language arts, and she refused to sign off on the standards. She said, these are terrible. We're stripping out all the great literature. We're going to reduce the critical thinking abilities of children. I'm not putting my name on this monstrosity. And since then, she's been testifying in state legislatures about what a disaster this is. And keep in mind, the members of this committee have described their role as that of a rubber stamp. So they put people on there who they assumed would be friendly to their intentions. And actually, Dr. Stotsky, I've interviewed her on a number of occasions. She said, I'm not opposed at all to national standards. The problem is these standards are atrocious. So she refused to sign off, and then they disappeared her down the memory hole, right? She never existed. Then on the math side, they had one math expert, Dr. James Milgram of Stanford University, and he also refused to sign off on the standards. He said these are as non-challenging as possible. They're terrible. Nobody's going to be ready for college using these standards. And get this, some of the standards are actually based on incorrect math. So we have national standards in place now across actually all 50 states, even though some of the states didn't agree initially, that are based in part on inaccurate, incorrect math. So, we have a serious problem here when the only two subject matter experts refuse to sign off on this. And, I could speak for hours on Common Core. It's basically the first overt set of national standards imposed by the Obama administration and enforced through federal bribes. But, basically they're just standardizing the dumbing down that's been going on for some generations now.
Sure, and of course there will be ideological biases inherent within the Common Core standards. Similarly, we've also seen ideological biases inherent to the entire textbook adoption process. Does the textbook adoption process change under Common Core, and what does that process look like now?
Well, what you had basically was all of the big textbook publishers scrambling to align their materials to Common Core. Now, as far as bias, I mean, these things are so biased. I think even an everyday parent who's not politically aware, maybe even an Obama supporter, would be shocked and appalled to find out the kinds of things that are in the textbooks nowadays masquerading as education. I mean, it is just overtly propaganda and indoctrination. And, people make the mistake of thinking Common Core is just for English and just for math. Actually, that's not true. Under the guise of English, they're also inserting themselves into history and into social studies and into science. They actually have the same Common Core people. It's not technically part of Common Core, but it's the same organization, it's the same structure, it's the same methodology for imposing it. They have the next generation science standards. So the key elements of this actually is that all the children must understand that humans are evil and are causing global warming, and we're all doomed unless we give the United Nations power to tax us and regulate us. And they must understand that we came from slime that came from rocks that turned into monkeys that became humans. And if they don't understand these things, then they don't know science as the Common Core people would like to define it. So what we have here is actually indoctrination into a worldview. And, this is not new. I really need to emphasize this because a lot of people who are new to the fight think, oh, my goodness, Obama and Common Core are ruining the children. Yeah, but, this is not a new thing. John Dewey was one of the first signers of the first Humanist Manifesto. The Humanist Manifesto has a very clear worldview. The very first point of this Humanist Manifesto is that we regard the universe as eternally self-existing, so there is no God. Compare that to the biblical worldview that was universal at the time of John Dewey, right? The very first words of the Bible is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So these worldviews are completely and totally fundamentally opposed to each other. They're not compatible in any way. The Humanist Manifesto also says that we need to get rid of private property and the means of production need to be controlled collectively. So, and that we need to move toward a world government, of course. So, these worldviews are completely and totally opposed to each other. But the American worldview, the Christian worldview, the worldview that the founders of this country had, is being displaced through indoctrination that's masquerading as objective education. And Common Core is really the next step in imposing this. But again, it's one step. Again, this has been going on for a long time, and we're not at the final destination yet either. There still have a good ways to go.
Could you explain, I know this is in your book somewhere, but how does the public school system create delinquency? Sure.
Well, there's a lot of ways that they create delinquency, and we explore some in the book. I think the pornographic sex education is really one of the good ones to narrow in on because it's so representative of what the school system has become. So, we can look at the UNESCO guidelines as an example. Teaching 4- and 5-year-olds about masturbation, teaching 8-year-olds about anal sex, things that I can't even talk about in public because they're just, ridiculous. You shouldn't, even grown-ups don't talk about these things, and yet they're teaching the kids that this is totally normal. So when they continue to teach the kids that, everybody's out having sex, everybody needs to do that, it's a totally normal thing to be doing this when you're 12 years old and experimenting with homosexual sex and, all kinds of things. What that does is it contributes to the delinquency of minors. And, that's just one of many. You have these anti-drug programs, for example, that have been shown conclusively to promote drug use. You have death education that has been shown to promote suicide. They teach the kids about under the guise of objective education, they teach, they have them write their own obituaries. They get them thinking about their own death. And then they go home and they kill themselves. You have the schools pushing drugs on students, right? So, they mess up the kids' minds, teaching them how to read using these quack methods, teaching them that, they came from slime and their life is no more valuable than the life of their dog or their goldfish. And you can take drugs, and that'll ease the pain, and so on. And so, these kids get all messed up in the head. They act out in school, and then they say, oh, you're acting out in school. You're not taking your brainwashing very well. So I guess you have a medical problem. We're going to diagnose you with, pick a label, ADD, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, whatever it is. And then they prescribe them these very powerful psychotropic drugs. So if we look at, for example, the drugs that are used to allegedly treat ADD and ADHD, what they call ADD and ADHD, we're talking about hardcore amphetamines here. So if a drug dealer showed up at a school and suggested that a 10-year-old boy start taking hardcore amphetamines, they would be arrested. It's crazy. But when the schools do it, suddenly, oh, this is medicine. This is for their own good. That's just absolute craziness. And, promoting drug use to children is not okay. So, there's just so many ways in which the schools are contributing to the delinquency of a minor. It's one of the many crimes that we talk about in the book. So.
Yeah, do you have any statistics as far as the ADD and ADHD diagnoses are concerned, as well as number of kids being put on these psychotropic drugs?
Yeah, it's very hard to find accurate numbers, but anywhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 school-age boys are now diagnosed with ADD and are taking these very hardcore medications. And, the side effects of these medications are nothing to mess around with. We're talking about addiction, we're talking about suicidal thoughts, homicidal thoughts. They put the kids on these antidepressants, the numbers are off the charts. They're enormous, and they're ballooning more and more every year because kids are acting out. They're being indoctrinated. They don't want to be dumbed down, even if they don't quite understand what's happening. And so, plus we have this whole industry built around it in partnership with the government. The big pharmaceutical industry really is tied at the hip with big government. And so the numbers are exploding. I mean, it's just off the charts how many of these kids are being deliberately drugged. And, I don't know if you know any of these kids who have been put on all these psychotropic medicines, but it's just tragic to see, what it does to them. I think becoming zombies is really almost an accurate description of what happens. They just, they lose their personality, they lose who they are, and they just, they're expected to just sit there and absorb this indoctrination. It's, it's a tragedy of massive proportions, but we know at least 10% of the kids, probably a lot more, have suffered from these, what I would argue, generally quack diagnoses.
So where do we go from here? I know you've said this isn't the end of the road, but where do you see that end being at, and what is the role of some of the other alternative schoolings that are available, such as private schools, charter schools, and homeschooling?
Excellent questions. Basically, the vision of the education establishment has already been made very clear to us. They're not even bothering to hide where they're going with this anymore. The UNESCO that I mentioned earlier, they have what they call the World Core Curriculum, what they think should be mandatory for all children all over the world to learn. I don't know how deep down the rabbit hole your listeners want to go, but the guy who came up with these World Core Curriculum, Robert Mueller, the former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, he passed away some years ago. He dedicated these standards to Alice Bailey. Now, for people who don't know who Alice Bailey is, that is a trip down the rabbit hole, right? She founded the Lucifer Publishing Company. She was an occultist. She called them spirit masters. She said these spirit masters would take over her body and write these books. And so she's got all these books out there, Education in the New Age, just a very bizarre person. And so the guy who wrote these world standards that they want in every school all over the world dedicated them to this occultist, Alice Bailey. So UNESCO, again, is not hiding their agenda. The head of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, a Bulgarian communist who served the People's Republic of Bulgaria, the mass murdering regime that executed hundreds of thousands of people, she's running all over the world telling anyone who will listen that UNESCO is using the schools to turn your children into green global citizens ready for the coming, green, sustainable, whatever world order that they're building. So there's no secret about where they're going anymore. They're telling us, they're shouting it from the rooftops where they want to go with this. They've got global standards for sex education and for reading and for math and for history and for everything else you can imagine. And they've told us what the purpose is, to shape the values and the attitudes of our children to be more amenable to this world order that they're constructing. Now, that doesn't have to be the end of the story, of course. That's kind of how we conclude our book. This is the vision that they want. Here's what they tell us they're doing. Obama's education secretary, Arne Duncan, before he stepped down a few months ago, he was also shouting off the rooftops, anybody who would listen, hey, we're working with UNESCO to transform your children into green global citizens. How many parents send their kids to school so they can be transformed into green global citizens? Frankly, I don't know a single one, right? And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find one. But that's what they tell us they're doing. So what Sam and I argue is that parents have an obligation to step in here, right? It's simply unacceptable for Americans to surrender their children to this kind of lunacy. We're going to lose our liberties and we're going to lose our country if we don't do something. And fortunately, there's still a lot of things we can do. Right? So I would say the first step is parents need to protect their kids from this. Get them out of the government schools. You mentioned Dave Rodriguez. He's got all kinds of ideas for alternative education, and I think that's what we need to be exploring. Homeschooling is certainly one very viable alternative. I highly encourage parents, if they can, to homeschool. But not everybody can homeschool. It's not for everybody. So there needs to be other options, right? I mean, private schools are good. Christian schools are good. There's a lot of things that people can be doing to protect their children from this, and they have an obligation to do that. But beyond that, we can't just forget about the kids in the government school system. Even if we didn't care about them at all, that would be pretty rotten of us. But even if we didn't care about them, our future depends on them too. Every dictator in the world has understood that if you want to impose totalitarianism on people, you need to do it through the minds of the young people. So we can't just abandon America's children in the government schools to be indoctrinated with this craziness. It's going to come back to haunt us. So I would say the American people need to get educated about this. They need to get active. And they need to organize to stop this. So we need to take back the education system from these utopians who, have told us where they want to go. And we need to restore education as it was properly understood, right? We can start with just the basics, reading, writing, math, right? Just basic stuff. And get rid of the indoctrination. And we really need to do that. I can't emphasize this strongly enough. If we do nothing, if we continue down this path, it is going to end in tragedy. So we must do something.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. Other than your book, which of course we've been talking about at great length, other than that, what resources do you recommend someone check out if they want to learn more about this subject? And also, what are the best ways for people to follow your work?
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. As for resources that people can get, there's so many out there on education, right? Charlotte Iserbitz has written great books on education. Dave Rodriguez is doing some great work in education. Dr. Sam Blumenfeld wrote, 12 books on education. There's so many resources out there. I've written very extensively in the New American and WorldNet Daily about education, right? I did some of the early reporting on Common Core long before this was even an issue. We were exposing this in the New American magazine. As for resources, one of the schools, the school that I teach at, Freedom Project Academy, it's a good alternative for parents who maybe don't have the time or don't think they have the ability to homeschool and want some help. Well, there are resources out there. As for people doing their own research, again, there's so much information out there. I would recommend, pick up the bibliography of our book, and just right there you'll find a huge amount of resources where you can continue study. You can look at the primary source documents and see where this is all going. But again, I really do encourage people to get educated. Don't take my word for it. Go do your own research, and I think you'll come to the same conclusions. But do the research and do get busy. So thanks again, guys, for the opportunity to come on the show. I really appreciate it, and keep up the great work.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/education-crimes. And of course, we'll link to Crimes of the Educators from there, as well as those 2 episodes with David Rodriguez. And we'll link to your Twitter handle at AlexNewman_JOU, and every other resource we've mentioned over the course of the interview. Your archive at the New American will be there as well. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/education-crimes is the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody to subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or their preferred podcatcher to make sure they can never miss an episode and keep up with the show, and also to sign up for our email list and follow us on Twitter at WC Podcast, which are also great ways to stay up to date with what's going on with the show. So Alex, thanks for joining us today, and we'll have to have you back on again sometime in the near future to continue this conversation.
I'd love to join you. So thank you guys again very much, and I look forward to chatting with you soon.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.